Hi, welcome to For Better For Verse, the podcast where a married couple, a theologian, and a philosopher take on the scriptures. I'm Justin Crisp.
I'm Jewelle Bickel, and today we are talking about Genesis 43 all the way to Exodus 12, or if you're following along with us in our readings, stays 14 to 20.
For those of you who are just joining us on For Better For Verse, we are working through the Bible Project's year-long read through the Bible. That's the schedule that we are referring to. Well, we're going to talk about three stories in particular. We're going to talk about Joseph and the conclusion of the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of the book of Genesis. We are going to take a look at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the story of Moses, and we haven't attended yet to any of the Psalms, which are assigned by the Bible Project's schedule. And so we're going to take a look at Psalm 14. Starting off, though, with Joseph. Do you want to give us just a bird's eye view of the story of Joseph, Joel? What's happening?
So, a lot has already happened. Coming in the middle of the story when we're at chapter 43. Remember, Jacob, Israel, has 12 sons. One of those sons is Joseph. He is Israel's favorite. So another good story of favoritism in families. And there are many ways in which Israel shows his favoritism on Joseph, but one of them is the infamous coat of many colors. He gives him a very nice coat. And Joseph doesn't always, he brags a little bit about being the favorite. He shows off the coat. He also has dreams that he interprets, including dreams of all his brothers bowing down to him, which, the older brothers really, really appreciate when one of the younger brothers is saying these things. So one day they decide to just beat him up and kill him. But then they're like, well, we won't kill him. We'll just sell him off into slavery. So he goes off to Egypt. He kind of bounces around there, ends up in the jail. But the whole time, God is with him, and God is kind of continuing to use him. And he ends up interpreting dreams for Pharaoh and saves the whole land from an upcoming famine. And that's close to where we are today.
Exactly. The only thing that I want to make sure the folks at home are tracking on is that Jacob has two wives. Jacob, aka Israel. Two wives, Leah and Rachel.
Right.
They're sisters. These are the daughters of Laban, about whom we talked last time.
Right. And we talked about how he was tricked into marrying Leah when he really wanted to marry Rachel.
Indeed. Joseph is one of Rachel's two sons with Jacob. The other is Benjamin. So of the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph is the penultimate. He's the next to youngest. He's not the absolute youngest. That's Benjamin, but he's the next to youngest. The sons of Leah are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, who will become important later on, Judah, also important later on, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then the two sons with Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin. And then Jacob also has sons, scandalous, with Rachel's maid, Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali. So he has two sons with Leah's maid, Zilpah, Gad, and Asher. So much for family values among the patriarchs. I'll just say, right? These folks are not in the Bible, as we talked last time, because they were paragons of virtue, particularly righteous. They are in the Bible because they are favored by God for some mysterious reason. God has commissioned them. God has conscripted them into his plan, his rescue plan to save the world.
Absolutely.
So this betrayal by Joseph ends up being for Joseph's, ends up working out to his benefit because he ends up in Egypt with a great deal of authority and power.
Absolutely. He ends up being like the right-hand man of Pharaoh. And not only does it end up in Joseph's benefit, but it also ends up benefiting everyone nearby, right? Because he helps them plan and prepare for this upcoming famine that's happening. So,
including Jacob and his family.
Including Jacob. So that's where we are. That's where we're at. So lo and behold, 10 of the brothers, everyone but the youngest, Benjamin, come to visit Egypt to get food, right? Because of the famine. And Joseph sees them, but they do not recognize Joseph, right? Personally, I feel like he's toying with them a little bit.
He totally does.
Oh, he's like, oh, who are you? Oh, do this, do that. How's your father? Asking them all kinds of questions. But one of the things he does is he says, you may not come back again unless you bring your other brother, aka his little brother, Benjamin. So where we start in chapter 43 is it's still really bad famine. And Jacob, Israel, says, go get us food. Go back to Egypt. And that's where Judah comes in. Judah says, okay, but we have to take Benjamin with us. The guy said we had to. And Israel, Jacob, said, Sorry, what? You think you're going to do what? Judah ends up saying, look, I will be responsible for him. I will take responsibility for keeping him safe. But if we need to get food, he has to come with me.
Yeah. When the sons of Israel arrive in Joseph's court, Joseph plays yet another trick on them. He has his household servants to basically put a lot of fancy, expensive stuff, a silver cup in particular, in the sack of Benjamin. And he uses this in order to charge Benjamin with a crime, with theft. And Benjamin's brothers come to Benjamin's defense, and it's Judah who offers himself in Benjamin's place.
And in fact, he goes on to tell the story of Joseph in way of explaining why Benjamin is so important to Jacob, why it is that they absolutely have to bring Benjamin back to him.
Yeah, exactly. Judah says to Joseph, he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. It's this moment where you get this dramatic irony. We know that it's Joseph, and Judah's re-narrating this story to him. Judah doesn't know he's talking to Joseph and narrating Joseph's own story.
To Joseph.
When Joseph hears this, I think when Joseph sees how his brothers are treating Benjamin differently than they treated him, he doesn't become jealous of Benjamin. Instead, he becomes moved with how much his brothers have grown. It says that at the beginning of chapter 45, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood before him, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the head of the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. And he will later say in chapter 50, even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. Joseph is able to see two things. One is he's able to see the change in his brothers and to see it without ego, to acknowledge the fact that they have grown and changed, and not to hold what they did to him against them forever. I mean, he certainly toys with them. They have to pay for what they've done, but he's able to reconcile with them for that reason. The second is that he's able, in retrospect, to look back on how God has used his suffering in order to bring good for him, for Joseph, for Joseph's family, who now gets to share in the plenty that he's ensured is going to be available in Egypt. And he goes on to save all of the people of Egypt too, through his conservative stewardship of food before the famine. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. He can see it after it's all happened, right? Could he see it necessarily in the, when he was in the pit, having been left by his brothers? Was he able to see it when he was in prison? That's for somebody else to know. But he certainly can see it looking back on it all. And that's how it often works in our lives, or at least it works that way in mine. I can see what God was doing through something that was extremely difficult at the time.
Absolutely. And sometimes we may not even ever be able to see that, right? We may not see that in our lives. I think that it was a gift. It was a grace to Joseph that God was able to reveal that to him so that he could have that confidence to forgive his brothers, knowing that that God had used this for good. One of the things about reading through all these stories, complicated stories of very complicated people, is that we can see this sort of thing happen and perhaps take comfort, encouragement from it for our own lives. So even when we can't see whether or not God is working our particular situation for good, that perhaps if we read over and over again of God using different things for good, Moses again in a minute, then that can give us some hope.
Absolutely. I just want to conclude our discussion of Joseph, which is really the conclusion of the story of the patriarchs, with the fact that we began the book of Genesis with a great betrayal, the betrayal of God by Adam and Eve, which was followed up by the betrayal of Abel by Cain, two brothers, two members of one family, one of whom killed the other. There is no redemption possible for Abel or Cain in this life. They did not have an opportunity to reconcile in this life because Abel was murdered by Cain. In this story, as well as in the story of Esau and Jacob, we saw two acts of incredible forgiveness. It's interesting. Joseph is Jacob's son, is Jacob's favorite. And yet it's not Jacob who he emulates in what I think is the spiritual high point of his life. It's the it's his uncle Esau, whom his father defrauded and tricked, right? I love that. I mean, it's almost prodigal son-esque, the moment when Jacob is going in to meet Esau and Esau runs out to greet him. Jacob is so afraid of what his brother is going to do to him, and his brother just wraps his arms around him, and it really is so incredibly beautiful. And this is a similar moment here at the end of the book of Genesis. You begin Genesis with betrayal and murder, and you end Genesis with somehow reconciliation, forgiveness, the whole family taken care of. It's happened with a lot of twists and turns. It was not straightforward how God worked this out, but the fact God worked it out through all those twists and turns, I think, is how history works in general. There's a prayer in the prayer book that says, that asks God to work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish his purposes on earth. And the book of Genesis is a great example of that.
It is a great example of that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So moving into Exodus.
Woo, and then let's talk about another not straightforward story.
Not straightforward.
So our transition from Genesis to Exodus is something along the lines of this. Joseph's family is all in Egypt. He's honored because he's helped save Egypt. But time goes on, generations pass, and Israel's family continues to grow. And the Egyptians, Pharaoh, get nervous about this. They don't know the history. They don't know the connection, and are hesitant to have such a strong, powerful family community among themselves. And so they eventually basically enslave all of Jacob's descendants in the area.
Yeah.
And not only do they enslave them, but then Pharaoh moves to have the boys killed.
Yeah.
Right. So he tells the midwives, if there's a baby boy, kill it. If it's a girl, let it live. Right. And hopes to cut out the population significantly.
Yeah.
And this is one of many times in which God uses women, I think, to outsmart powerful men in the Bible. So
thanks be to God.
It's a favorite of mine. The midwives say, oh, they have birth too quickly. We can't help them. What are we going to do? So eventually Pharaoh then says, okay, I'm going to take care of killing the baby boys. So a young boy is born. And I love this. This is one of my favorite parts. She saw that he was a fine baby. And so she hit him. He looked good. He was a good baby. So this Levite woman hit him. And when she couldn't hide him anymore, she puts him in a basket. And this is our friend Moses.
Moses is picked up out of the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter, and she asks Moses' sister, thinking it's just a random person in her household staff, to find a nurse for Moses. And of course, Moses' sister chooses their mother. And Moses' mother manages to thwart Pharaoh's plans and gets to enjoy those first couple of years of child rearing with her son, even though technically her son has now been welcomed into Pharaoh's household.
Of course, things can't go that smoothly. Eventually, Moses has to flee from Egypt because he has killed an Egyptian because he saw them beating one of his fellow Hebrews.
He just can't take it. He just loses it. He kills this guy, and he's observed.
And he just makes a run for it. So he eventually ends up out in the wilderness. He's out there with his flock. Out of nowhere, he sees a bush that looks like it is on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. And personally, I really love this next conversation we have between God and Moses. And there's a lot of really cool parts in it. But I think one of the things I like about it the most is that Moses is so reluctant. He does not want to be a hero for God.
Yeah.
He really doesn't. And God is patient most of the time, mostly, but doesn't back down.
No, God wants to conscript Moses for his service yet again, and he wants for Moses to go to Pharaoh and liberate the people of Israel from Pharaoh. And that's what Moses feels incapable of doing. I mean, that's pretty reasonable, right? You got this guy who murdered an Egyptian, ran away for fear that he was gonna, get executed in return, and then God commissions him to go be the liberator of his people. And he's like, I don't think so. God calls to Moses out of the bush. God commands Moses to remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you were standing is holy ground. And the idea that, we're supposed to take off our shoes in the presence of the holy, there is really something about that. In the presence of the holy, you take off your shoes, you kneel down, you get low, you just get low in front of the holy. Then God identifies God's self as the God of Moses' father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. This becomes a way that God refers to himself in the Hebrew Bible as the God of the patriarchs, whose story we've just been retelling. Another wonderful part of this story is when Moses asks God his name.
Isn't that amazing?
I mean, it's so interesting. Moses says to God, this is verse 13 of chapter 3, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask to me, well, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am.
So there's a lot going on. We can unpack that, right?
A lot going on.
So first of all, most of the gods during this time period had names. If you think about the Egyptian gods or whatever, they would have different names. The sun god, Re, etc. So it's not shocking that Moses would say, what's your name?
No, reasonable.
Reasonable for him to say, I need a name to tell, if they ask me about the name. God's response is powerful. And unfortunately, our English translation just doesn't cut it. The term Yahweh is what's being said there. And I am who I am is sort of the best way to translate it. There was a tradition for the Hebrew people that they did not ever say that because it was God's name. And to say a name would be sort of have some sort of power over it, right? And we can't have power over God. So instead they would say something else in the place of it, usually Adonai.
Which means Lord in Hebrew.
Right. So when you see throughout, scripture from now on, it's going to say the Lord, this. It's this personal name.
Yahweh, YHWH, the Holy Tetragrammaton.
Yes. And it is in some ways. He's basically telling Moses, this is my name. This is what you call me. And
the fact that the name Yahweh is connected to the Hebrew verb hayah, which means to be. The fact that, the closest English translation is something like I am who I am, or I will be what I will be. I think that this is the Hebrew Bible coming gradually to an awareness of God as like the ground of being, to quote the 20th century theologian Paul Tillich. I don't mean to like back project modern theology into the scriptures, but modern theology, old theology is trying to interpret the scriptures, and there is biblical basis for this stuff, regardless of whether the authors had that exactly in mind. The truth of the scriptures can transcend the author's intent for the words that they wrote. The whole premise of the Bible being a word through which God speaks is that
there's more happening than just whatever the author's intent was.
Completely. I love the fact that God's name here is connected to sheer existence, sheer being, that God is a creator and that God is this source of creative activity, existence, being, power, and so on. It's really close to the way Thomas Aquinas defined God, which is to say God's essence is also God's existence. God is like sheer existence. That's what it means for God to be God.
Sheer existence, yes. And it is, and it's really, I think it says a lot about God that God's name is just to be, I am, right? And it also could be some sort of theological things. Thinking about God, even when we were back in Genesis, right? Flood. God gets upset about the flood, about humanity and how they're acting. And so he has a flood. But God decides to be the kind of God that doesn't eliminate the world. I am who I am. I will be who I will be, right? And God makes these decisions. So God decides to act in love. And God continually does that over and over. So even though Abraham fails him, even though Isaac fails him, even though Jacob fails him, continues to choose them over and over again. That's the sort of person God is making God's self.
Oh, wow. The theologian Karl Barth suggests that God self-determines what kind of God is going to be. God commits God's self to being a particular kind of God, namely, though, to be the one who loves in freedom. That, when God is making these covenants, when God is choosing freely not to wipe the slate clean after he's done so with the flood, God is choosing to be a particular kind of God. We don't have a God in the abstract. We have a God who is concrete, and a God who is determined to be this kind of God for us. You're saying that goes all the way back to this idea of I am who I am. God gets to choose. It's a little maybe not quite right, but God self-determines who God is.
Yes, God self-determines who God is. And God self-determining again and again is a God of love, God of forgiveness, God working towards salvation, even if we don't know what that looks like yet.
That's beautiful. There's one more thing that I want to observe about Moses, whose story we will pick up next time, is that when Moses objects to being the liberator of Israel, God has a particular response. So chapter 3, verse 10, God says, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you." I love the fact that Moses feels inadequate to the task. Moses says, "I can't do this. Who am I that I should do this?" And God's answer is not, "Well, actually, Moses, you're really very talented. You're really very gifted. You have lots of natural gifts, and you're just forgetting those things. You're perfectly qualified to go do this thing." He doesn't puff Moses up. He doesn't actually say Moses is any better than Moses thinks Moses is. His answer is, "I will be with you." That's it. It's not about Moses's resume or his skills and qualifications.
He was picked.
It's just that he was picked and chosen. And that's exactly the way it worked with all the patriarchs. It's exactly the way it's worked with this people from the very beginning. God has called this people and then made it possible for them by his own action and grace to fulfill the purposes he asked for them. Not that he saw something promising in them and then said, "Okay, I'm going to maximize that potential right there."
No, it's even in spite maybe of lack of potential.
That's right. The little pithy thing that I was taught as a kid is that God qualifies the called rather than calling the qualified.
Yep. I remember that too.
Comforting to all of us who might, like Moses, occasionally say, "Who am I that I should do whatever it is
I'm
God
not
has told me to
eloquent. Why
do?"
are you? Why are you making me talk?
Oh, man, I do love that. Yeah, when Moses says he's not eloquent, God
I
says,
understand that.
God's like, "Yeah, okay, you're not eloquent. How about your brother? How about Aaron?"
Aaron's okay. We'll get him.
Yeah, more about Aaron next time. So taking a look at our psalm then, in conclusion, Psalm 14 begins with this wild line: "Fools say in their hearts, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is no one who does good." I'm wondering, in a world where there's a lot of folks who doubt God's existence, is the author of the Psalms just saying, well, they're fools? Is that really what's going on here?
That's an interesting question. So I have to admit, this verse has a lot of connotations, especially for the people in the world who care about medieval philosophy of religion, which is kind of my guilty pleasure. I quite love that.
Yeah.
Anselm of Canterbury begins with his ontological argument, which is ontology means being. So we're back to being again, right? He begins his argument by quoting this: "The fool says in their hearts, there is no God." And then even more famously, he gets a response from another monk, Ganillo, who says, on behalf of the fool, right? He writes on behalf of the fool, countering Anselm's argument. So that's the first thing that comes to mind when I first see this.
Yeah. Anselm will go on to say that there is inside of us all a kind of natural idea of God, and that this idea of God includes the fact that God would exist and that God sort of definitionally exists. Is that how I'm supposed to understand Anselm here, Jewel?
Okay, so I want you to imagine a really good party. Think about a really good party. You might think about like our wedding. Our wedding was a really good party.
It certainly was.
It was. Now I want you to think about the perfect party. Perfect party. Okay, got that in your mind?
I think.
Okay. Now, here's the question. Perfect party that you've thought of in your head, your mind. Is a party that actually exists better than the one in your mind?
Oh, wow.
Right?
It certainly is. I mean, I can imagine a perfect party, but if I don't actually get to like eat any of the snacks and enjoy any of the drinks, I'd rather have the party that actually exists than the party that exists only in my head.
Absolutely. So that's sort of a little bit like the argument that Anselm makes. Basically, he calls God that than which nothing greater could be thought.
Okay.
So God is not just the perfect being, but sort of beyond perfection. Nothing greater can be thought than God, right? But if there's a God that exists, that would be greater than just the idea of God.
Oh, wow.
So, in that sense, part of the definition of God then
Yeah.
would be God in existence. Now, there's a lot to say about this argument. A lot of people laugh at it. It's actually a really elegant argument,
Yeah.
especially if you are familiar with modal logic at all, which is logic about necessity and possibility.
Yeah.
Right? Bertrand Russell, who's a famous atheist philosopher, once said that he was a theist for a whole week after reading this argument because of how sort of strong it is. So it might sound silly as we're describing it, but there's something to this, as we said earlier about God's I am who I am. Now, granted, there's lots of critiques of this, right? Like that existence isn't really a characteristic, a quality that people have,
Mm.
but there's still, as I said, something about being, particularly God's being, that I think this argument points to.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's cool. What I noticed in this psalm is a connection between belief in God
Mhm.
and not necessarily perfect moral uprightness, but the belief in an objective good and
Mhm.
evil. I mean, the reason people are corrupt and do abominable deeds, and there is no one who does good, as it says in the first verse of the psalm, is because in verse 4, it says,
Mhm.
have they no knowledge? All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord. Have they no knowledge? Have they no knowledge of like the objective moral law? And there are a number of people, such as Immanuel Kant,
Mhm.
who you specialize in,
I
and
wouldn't say specialized, but
oh, you know a lot more about him than I do. Kant thinks that believing in God is the bedrock of any kind of objective understanding of good and bad, any objective understanding of morality.
morality.
I think that for modern people to hear the fool says in their heart, there is no God, they might bristle at that and think, oh, well, I occasionally doubt God's
Mhm.
existence. I
Mhm.
wonder if I actually, am I a fool? Is the
Yeah.
Bible being disrespectful to me and just like calling me out and calling me names? I don't think so. I think that what the Bible is asking us, do you believe in an objective good and evil? Do you believe in an objective moral law? Maybe we don't have a complete understanding of it. I would certainly say we do not. But
We can have access to all of it,
right.
knowledge of it all,
But the idea that there is no objective standard of right and wrong is a really frightening possibility. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche believes there is no objective standard for right and wrong. And that leads Nietzsche into some really wild places that we don't have enough time in this podcast today to discuss. But the opposite of Nietzsche, for whom God is dead and for whom there is no objective right and wrong, is Kant, for whom God does exist because Kant just cannot get over this conviction that there is an objective moral law.
and there has to be someone who is responsible for that moral law.
Absolutely. And I think that in a world like ours, which is so adrift and where there are so many different competing visions of what is good, for us to acknowledge and to know that we might have an imperfect understanding of objective right and wrong, but there is such a thing.
Mm.
That itself is as good as believing in God in the mind of the psalmist.
Mm.
More would that more of us would more readily acknowledge the existence of such an objective standard, even while we also
Even-
acknowledge that we fall as short of it as the patriarchs and the matriarchs did in the Old Testament.
Oh, absolutely.
So next time, whether we have as much philosophical talk in our next podcast,
Thank you.
we will be looking at the conclusion of the story of the book of Exodus. Today, we looked at the conclusion of the story of the patriarchs, the unbelievable reconciliation and forgiveness enjoyed by Joseph, which is a fabulous foil to the betrayal and the murder that the book of Genesis introduced to us. We took a look at the book of Exodus and Moses' introduction to us, God conscripting Moses into his service and qualifying him just because God wants to, not because God thinks he's particularly gifted or talented. And then we took a look at Psalm 14 and thought a little bit about morality, God's existence, and what it means to say the word God. What do we mean when we say God? That's actually been in the air of a lot of the conversation we've had today.
Absolutely.
Please like, share, and subscribe any way that you get your podcasts. Help us to share the good news of the God of the Bible with the world in need.